The love between Teddy Pendergrass and Taaz Lang was not a standard romance. It was a lethal rebellion against the dark underworld behind Philly soul. He was the multi-million-dollar voice of Philadelphia International Records, and she was the fearless strategist actively fighting the mafia to secure his freedom. That devotion was met with a point-blank execution. In 1977, a professional hitman gunned Taaz down on her doorstep, leaving her cash and diamonds completely untouched. The untouched valuables led many investigators and industry insiders to a chilling conclusion. This wasn't a robbery. It was a targeted hit designed to silence the only person actively disrupting the underworld's control over a captive superstar. Behind the glittering mythology of the 1970s entertainment business lay a brutal economic reality. Philadelphia was undergoing an immense cultural transition. During this era, the city birthed a musical phenomenon known globally as the sound of Philadelphia. It was a magnificent, sweeping style of soul music characterized by lush string arrangements, driving rhythms, and socially conscious or deeply romantic lyrics. The architects behind this sound built an unprecedented hit-making empire, turning local talent into international commodities. However, beneath the artistic genius of the producers and musicians lay an inherently toxic, exploitative ecosystem. Many historians and industry veterans who survived that era suggest that the independent recording industry of the 1970s functioned much like a velvet-lined plantation system. It was a machine designed to extract maximum capital from black artists while maintaining absolute control over their autonomy. The artists, frequently young individuals plucked from impoverished neighborhoods, were treated as raw materials rather than partners. The business model relied entirely on financial obfuscation and psychological manipulation. When a singer signed a contract, they were immediately handed the superficial symbols of extreme wealth. There were fleets of Cadillacs, full-length fur coats, diamond rings, and lavish parties. The media photographed them living like royalty, cementing the public perception of their success. But this was an orchestrated illusion. These luxury items were rarely gifts. They were advances, meticulously recorded as recoupable expenses against the artist's future, heavily restricted royalty rates. The artists were actively encouraged to spend, to live extravagantly, because every dollar spent plunged them deeper into a well of debt to the record label. They were generating tens of millions of dollars in record sales, publishing rights and touring revenue, yet the actual liquid capital flowed upwards, safely secured in the bank accounts of the executives and their silent partners. The performers were essentially indentured servants wearing tailored silk. They were financially illiterate by design, kept entirely in the dark regarding the actual accounting of their own careers. This environment of economic subjugation was not merely maintained by clever lawyers and predatory contracts. It was enforced by the very real, ever-present threat of physical violence. In Philadelphia during this specific decade, the boundary separating legitimate entertainment enterprises from organized street crime was virtually non-existent. Numerous investigative reports and historical crime archives indicate that the city's underworld, most notably a formidable and ruthless syndicate known as the Black Mafia, held a suffocating grip on the local nightlife and entertainment sectors. This was not a subtle influence. These organizations controlled the security at major venues, dictated which records received airplay, through illicit arrangements with radio promoters and established protection rackets that targeted the most lucrative businesses in the city, which included the music industry. The recording studios and executive offices were frequently populated by men whose authority stemmed not from musical expertise, but from their capacity for violence. A strict, unwritten law governed the lives of the artists operating within this ecosystem. The law was simple: accept the spotlight, enjoy the cars, sing the songs, and never under any circumstances question the money. To demand an independent audit of your own record sales or to challenge the financial authority of the managers assigned to you was viewed as an act of profound disrespect. It was not a breach of contract. It was a threat to the primary revenue stream, the rice pot, of men who resolved disputes with firearms rather than litigation. The artists were entirely aware of this invisible perimeter. They understood that their physical safety and their careers were entirely contingent upon their silent compliance. They smiled for the cameras, collected their meager allowances, and tried to ignore the dangerous men standing in the back of the room. Teddy Pendergrass possessed a generational talent. His voice was an instrument of astonishing power, capable of conveying deep vulnerability alongside overwhelming masculine strength. He was the golden goose of the Philadelphia sound, yet his psychological foundation was deeply fractured. Despite his imposing physical stature and hypermasculine stage presence, Teddy carried a deeply ingrained fear of the system that had elevated him from poverty. Terrified of losing his lavish lifestyle and averse to conflict, his default mechanism against aggressive management was absolute submission. He became a captive giant, biting his tongue and singing louder, desperately hoping his talent would shield him from the exploitation he knew was occurring. Her name was Taaz Lang, and her presence fundamentally disrupted the carefully controlled environment built around the superstar. The industry handlers initially dismissed her as just another attractive companion, a temporary fixture in the entourage of a famous man. This was a catastrophic miscalculation. Archival accounts and testimonies from those within their private circle reveal a woman of formidable intellect, razor-sharp strategic vision, and an unyielding, fearless resolve. Taaz Lang did not suffer from the same institutionalized fear that paralyzed Teddy. She looked at the sprawling, intimidating machinery of the Philadelphia music scene and did not see untouchable titans. She saw a collection of men systematically and brazenly robbing the man she loved. She saw through the illusion of the fur coats and the leased luxury cars. Although their romantic relationship had ended by 1977, Taaz remained his manager and his fiercest protector. In a world that viewed Teddy purely as a commodity, she was the singular entity actively fighting for his autonomy. She became his psychological anchor. While Teddy was exhausted from the relentless touring schedules and the pressure of maintaining his public persona, Taaz remained hyper-vigilant. She did not sit idly in the VIP sections drinking champagne. She watched the managers. She observed the flow of cash at the venue doors. She listened to the conversations in the studio quarters. She began to comprehend the terrifying mathematics of his subjugation, realizing that his immense global success was paradoxically cementing his financial imprisonment. The more records he sold, the more indispensable he became to the syndicate, and the tighter the leash was drawn around his neck. Her love for him was the catalyst for a quiet, incredibly dangerous rebellion. Taaz recognized that Teddy's fatal weakness, his inability to confront his handlers, meant that she had to assume the role of the aggressor. She understood that appealing to the morality of the record label executives was futile. They were operating a highly profitable, well-protected machine, and they would not voluntarily relinquish their control over their most valuable asset. The only path to survival, the only way to secure a future where Teddy was not a wealthy slave, was to completely sever ties with the entire ecosystem. This was a monumental undertaking. It meant navigating a labyrinth of complex legal contracts, confronting managers who were closely aligned with organized crime, and doing so without triggering a violent retaliation before their escape route was fully secured. Taaz began her operation with meticulous stealth. She started asking the questions that artists were strictly forbidden to ask. She requested copies of recording contracts, publishing agreements, and tour expense reports. She bypassed the standard channels of communication and began building a shadow archive of financial records. This was not a sudden dramatic outburst. It was a cold, calculated gathering of intelligence. She was acting as an independent auditor, piecing together the true scale of the financial theft. The handlers eventually noticed the shift in the atmosphere. The men who were accustomed to unquestioning obedience suddenly found themselves fielding inquiries from a woman who refused to be intimidated by their proximity to violence. They attempted to marginalize her, spreading rumors and attempting to fracture the relationship, knowing that separating Teddy from Taaz was the easiest way to regain total psychological control over him. But the bond between them was unbreakable. The more the industry pushed back, the more resolute Taaz became. She was not merely trying to negotiate a better percentage on his next album. She was planning to dismantle the entire structure of his management. Her ultimate objective was to establish an entirely independent corporate entity, a management and production company that would handle every aspect of Teddy Pendergrass's career, cutting out the middlemen, the label executives, and the silent partners who were draining his wealth. She was drawing a blueprint for absolute autonomy. In the context of 1970s Philadelphia, this was not viewed as a standard business maneuver. It was viewed as an act of treason. By preparing to pull Teddy out of the system, Taaz Lang was not just protecting her partner. She was directly threatening to cut off the multi-million-dollar lifeblood of a deeply entrenched, highly dangerous criminal enterprise. She was walking into the lion's den armed only with ledgers and an absolute fearless love, unaware that the men in the shadows had already decided that a financial audit was punishable by death. The public was presented with an image of absolute, unassailable confidence. When Teddy performed, he was a force of nature. He sweated, he growled, he commanded the stage with a hyper-masculine energy that captivated millions. However, the physical manifestation of his internal psychological state, once the stage lights were extinguished, was one of profound, paralyzing exhaustion and paranoia. He was a man holding up the weight of an entire economic ecosystem, and he knew it. He was surrounded by an entourage, yet he was fundamentally isolated. The managers, the promoters, the bodyguards provided by the label, none of these individuals worked for him. They worked for the syndicate. Their primary function was not his well-being. It was his containment. They monitored his movements, filtered his communications and ensured he remained focused entirely on generating revenue. He was trapped in a golden cage, and his fatal weakness was his deep-seated desire to avoid confrontation with the men who held the keys. He had grown up in poverty, and the fear of being stripped of his newly acquired wealth and status kept him completely subservient. He would rather endure the financial exploitation than risk the violent destruction of his career. Taaz Lang was the absolute antithesis of this compliance. She did not possess his fatal weakness. While Teddy sought approval, Taaz sought clarity. Her background and her inherent psychological makeup rendered her immune to the standard intimidation tactics deployed by the recording industry. She did not care about the VIP access, the complimentary champagne, or the proximity to fame. When she looked at the executives and the silent partners hovering in the back of the recording studios, she did not see benefactors. She saw parasites. The dynamic between Teddy and Taaz was not a conventional romance. It was a highly strategic symbiotic alliance designed for survival. Teddy provided the raw, undeniable talent that generated the capital. Taaz provided the intellectual armor required to protect that capital. She became his proxy, the buffer between the artist and the machine. While Teddy was secluded in vocal booths pouring his soul into a microphone, Taaz was standing in the corridors, watching the executives calculating the attendance figures at the arenas and listening to the quiet, dangerous conversations happening just out of earshot. She was gathering intelligence. The gap between what the public perceived and the inner reality of their lives was vast and terrifying. The public saw a glamorous couple attending industry parties. The reality was that Taaz was meticulously building a case against the most dangerous men in Philadelphia. She began to execute an independent, unauthorized audit of Teddy's entire financial structure. This was an operation that required immense discretion and nerves of steel. In the mid-1970s, there were no digital records that could be easily copied or downloaded. Gathering financial data meant physically accessing filing cabinets, intercepting paper correspondence, and cross-referencing publicly available concert grosses against the meager royalty checks Teddy was actually receiving. Taaz discovered that the exploitation was not a matter of minor accounting errors. It was a massive industrialized system of theft. She uncovered phantom expenses charged to his account for promotional tours that never occurred. She found that the publishing rights to the songs he made famous were entirely owned by entities connected to the label, ensuring that the long-term passive income generated by his voice would never reach his bank account. Furthermore, she realized that the astronomical touring revenues, the cash generated at the doors of massive stadiums, were being systematically siphoned off to pay consulting fees and security retainers to organizations directly affiliated with the Black Mafia. When Taaz presented these findings to Teddy, the psychological impact was devastating. The contradiction was absolute. The man whose voice was making other men millionaires over and over again was, on paper, barely breaking even. His initial reaction was predictably rooted in his fatal weakness. He was terrified. Confronting the label meant confronting the underworld. He understood the unwritten laws of the city better than anyone. He knew what happened to individuals who disrupted the flow of illicit money. He pleaded with her to leave it alone, to accept the situation as the unavoidable cost of doing business in the entertainment industry. He argued that they had enough to live comfortably, that rocking the boat could cost them everything, including their lives. But Taaz refused to capitulate. Her love for him was defined by a fierce, uncompromising demand for his dignity. She could not tolerate watching a brilliant man be treated as an expendable asset by criminals in tailored suits. She slowly and systematically dismantled his fear, replacing his paranoia with a sense of righteous anger. She convinced him that they did not need the machine. The machine needed him. Without his voice, the entire predatory structure would collapse. This realization marked the point of no return. They transitioned from passive victims of an exploitative system to active combatants. The plan they formulated was breathtaking in its audacity. They were not simply going to hire new lawyers and attempt to renegotiate his existing contracts. That approach would have left them vulnerable to endless litigation and backdoor intimidation. Instead, they decided to completely sever all ties and establish total independence. The entity was to be called Taaz Productions. This new corporation would act as his sole management, booking agency, and eventual production house. By creating this company, they were effectively declaring a legal and economic war on the Philadelphia International Records hierarchy, and by extension, the syndicate that protected it. They were planning to starve the beast. The execution of this plan required a terrifying level of operational security. They were essentially living behind enemy lines. Every day, Teddy had to walk into the recording studio, smile at the producers, shake hands with the managers. He was actively planning to destroy and sing songs about heartbreak and devotion. He had to perform the role of the obedient superstar flawlessly. Any slip in his demeanor, any hint of the rebellion brewing beneath the surface could trigger an immediate and violent response. The psychological toll of this daily deception was immense. The physical manifestations of their stress became apparent to those closest to them. Teddy suffered from severe insomnia. Taaz became hypervigilant, constantly checking the locks on their doors and monitoring the vehicles parked on their street. The atmosphere in their home shifted from a sanctuary of love to a war room. Documents were hidden. Phone lines were treated as compromised. They were acutely aware that they were under surveillance. The men who controlled the Philadelphia music scene were not oblivious to the shifting dynamics. They noticed that Taaz was asking too many questions, that she was blocking access to Teddy, and that the usual methods of manipulation were no longer effective. The pushback from the establishment began with subtle warnings. There were friendly sit-downs orchestrated by industry veterans, heavily suggesting that Taaz was out of her depth, that the music business was too complicated for a woman without formal experience, and that she should step aside and let the professionals handle Teddy's career. When these patronizing tactics failed to deter her, the warnings escalated into direct intimidation. Anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night, heavy-set men lingering near her car when she left the grocery store, veiled threats regarding the physical safety of their families. The message was unambiguous: back down or face the consequences. The syndicate was trying to exploit Teddy's known weakness, hoping that the pressure would force him to abandon Taaz and return to the fold. But the intimidation tactics produced the opposite effect. Instead of breaking their alliance, the threats forged it into steel. Taaz accelerated the legal groundwork for Taaz Productions. She began securing independent financing, seeking out lawyers, outside the state of Pennsylvania who were not compromised by local mob ties and drafting the termination letters that would formally sever Teddy from his existing management contracts. She was methodically cutting the strings of the puppet masters. As the spring of 1977 approached, the tension in Philadelphia had reached a boiling point. The industry executives realized that Taaz Lang could not be bought, could not be intimidated, and could not be separated from Teddy. She had successfully insulated him, and she was days away from finalizing the paperwork that would cost the syndicate millions of dollars in annual revenue. She had crossed the invisible line. She had moved from being an annoyance to being an existential threat to the established order. In the early months of 1977, Teddy Pendergrass was preparing to launch his first massive solo album after leaving Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes. The airways were saturated with anticipation. The record label was projecting massive profits. The public was eagerly awaiting the return of the ultimate romantic idol. Yet, behind the closed doors of their Philadelphia home, Teddy and Taaz were preparing for an extraction. The contradiction is jarring. The world was preparing to celebrate a fabricated image of romantic triumph, while the real human beings behind the music were fighting a desperate, terrifying battle for basic financial autonomy and physical survival. Every time a fan purchased a record or bought a concert ticket, they were unknowingly funding the very criminal enterprise that was actively hunting the artists they idolized. The music itself was weaponized against its creator. Taaz Lang was fully aware of the danger. She was not naive. She understood the caliber of the men she was challenging. However, her fatal decision, the choice that ultimately dictated her destiny, was prioritizing Teddy's freedom over her own physical security. She believed that once the legal documents were signed and filed, once the separation was formalized in the eyes of the law and the media, the syndicate would be forced to back down to avoid a federal scrutiny. She underestimated the brazen brutality of the Black Mafia. She assumed they were businessmen who utilized violence as a tool of last resort. She did not realize that violence was their primary language and that they considered the public execution of a problem to be a far more effective business strategy than a protracted legal battle. As April arrived, the documents for Taaz Productions were nearly finalized. The rebellion was fully documented and ready to be deployed. Teddy and Taaz were standing on the absolute precipice of freedom. They had survived the psychological warfare, they had navigated the treacherous landscape of the industry, and they had built an escape pod capable of withstanding the inevitable fallout. They allowed themselves a brief, dangerous moment of relief, believing that the hardest part of the war was behind them. They did not know that the men in the shadows had already convened, evaluated the threat, and concluded that a financial audit of their operations could not be permitted to proceed under any circumstances. The ledger of Teddy Pendergrass's career was about to be balanced, not with lawyers or accountants, but with gunpowder. The system had investigated the anomaly, and it had issued its final irrevocable verdict. The exact date in April 1977 is often blurred in the collective nostalgic memory, overshadowed by the massive platinum-selling albums that immediately followed, but the physical reality of that night remains permanently etched in the suppressed police archives. Taaz Lang was returning to the residence she shared with Teddy. The timeline and the geography of the evening are critical to understanding the nature of the crime. She was not wandering through a dangerous, neglected neighborhood. She was standing on her own doorstep in a space that was supposed to be a secure sanctuary for a wealthy executive and her superstar partner. The prosecution of this historical moment relies entirely on the physical evidence left at the scene, because the raw data deliberately and entirely contradicts the official sanitized narrative. The local police report, hastily filed and readily accepted by a compliant, unquestioning local press, labeled the incident a robbery gone wrong. It was packaged for the public as a tragic, random act of urban violence, a symptom of a rough city. When the authorities arrived, they found Taaz Lang fatally wounded. The killers had approached her with terrifying, silent precision. There were no signs of a chaotic, prolonged physical struggle for a handbag. The shooter, or shooters, fired at extremely close range and vanished into the night. It was a calculated, hyper-efficient execution. Now we must look at what was left behind on the pavement. Her purse containing a significant amount of cash, several $100s, which represented a highly lucrative target for any desperate street thief in 1977, was completely untouched. Her keys were still present in her hand. Most damning of all, she was wearing highly visible, exceptionally valuable jewelry, expensive gifts given to her by Teddy that served as physical symbols of their alliance and his success. These items remained exactly where they were on her body. A panicked mugger rarely leaves a fortune in diamonds and cash. The physical evidence strongly pointed to a professional execution. The objective wasn't wealth, it was the immediate termination of a threat. The mechanics of the subsequent cover-up were just as brutal and efficient as the murder itself. In a functioning, uncorrupted justice system, the brazen assassination of a high-profile manager intimately connected to the city's single biggest musical export would trigger a massive, relentless federal investigation. Subpoenas would be aggressively issued, financial records from the record labels would be seized, and powerful industry executives would be interrogated under oath. That is absolutely not what happened in Philadelphia. The investigation moved with a deliberate, agonizing, and highly suspicious sluggishness. Promising leads were inexplicably ignored. Potential witnesses within the music industry suddenly developed severe amnesia, terrified of becoming the next casualty in what they recognized as an internal power struggle. The immense political and financial capital of the recording syndicate was mobilized not to find the killers, but to ensure the killers were never found. The case file was quietly, systematically buried under layers of bureaucracy. It transitioned from an active homicide investigation into a cold file with terrifying speed. The deafening silence of the law enforcement agencies was the final devastating proof of the syndicate's absolute power. They had successfully demonstrated that they could execute a brilliant woman on her own doorstep and simply instruct the city administration to forget her name. For Teddy Pendergrass, the physical bullets that struck Taaz Lang effectively ended his own life as a free man. When the news of her murder reached him, the psychological destruction was total and absolute. He did not merely lose a romantic partner, he lost the architect of his freedom. He lost the only human being on earth who possessed both the courage and the intellect to stand between him and the predators. And the most agonizing part of his grief was that he knew exactly why she died. There was no mystery in his mind, nor was there any mystery in the minds of anyone inside the inner circle of the music business. The terrified whispers in the studio quarters named the men who likely ordered the hit. The profound tragedy is that Teddy's fatal weakness, his deep-seated institutionalized fear of the system and his aversion to conflict, was magnified 1,000-fold by her murder. The most chilling aspect of the weeks following her funeral is the cold bureaucratic efficiency with which the old management structure reasserted their total control over his life. The independent company Taaz Lang had sacrificed her life to build, Taaz Productions, was ruthlessly dismantled before it could even legally operate. The termination letters she had drafted to fire his handlers were destroyed. The independent lawyers she had consulted were dismissed without payment. While Teddy was completely submerged in an ocean of grief, heavily medicated, and psychologically shattered, the very men who were widely suspected of orchestrating the assassination of his partner stepped right back into his daily life. They took absolute control of his schedule, his finances, and his physical security. They presented themselves to the media as his loyal protectors, guiding the grieving artist through an unspeakable tragedy, while simultaneously locking the heavy iron door of his cage from the outside. The execution had achieved its primary economic objective perfectly. The rebellion was violently crushed, the dangerous financial audit was permanently halted, and the multi-million-dollar revenue stream was secured for the foreseeable future. Shortly after the murder, the relentless machinery of the music business demanded that Teddy return to work. The new solo album was ready to be pressed. The highly lucrative national tour dates were already booked. The syndicate needed their return on investment, and grief was not considered a valid excuse for halting production. Picture the physical reality of those subsequent performances. Teddy Pendergrass, dressed impeccably in white silk, stepping into the blinding glare of the spotlights in sold-out arenas across the country. The crowd is screaming, completely intoxicated by the manufactured image of the ultimate powerful lover. He was contractually required to perform his hit love songs, tracks dripping with romantic intimacy and devotion. But the man singing those lyrics is a hostage. He is standing on a stage, pouring his phenomenal vocal talent into a microphone, knowing with absolute certainty that the millions of dollars generated by his performance are flowing directly into the bank accounts of the organization that slaughtered the love of his life. He had to smile. He had to point to the women weeping in the front row, hand out red roses, and project an aura of supreme, untouchable masculine confidence. But if you look closely at the archival footage from those specific post-1977 tours, if you strip away the lush string arrangements and look only at his eyes, the physical manifestation of his terror is acutely visible. He was a man performing at gunpoint, even if the gun was not visible to the audience. And the most terrifying part of his daily reality was the VIP section. In those reserved velvet-roped seats, drinking complimentary expensive liquor and watching him sweat under the lights, were the industry executives, the promoters, and the known associates of the Black Mafia. He had to sing his heart out to the men who murdered his protector. He had to be publicly grateful to them. He had to shake their hands backstage, pose for photographs with them, and thank them for their continuous guidance. The psychological violence of this daily routine is almost incomprehensible to the average person. Every single note he sang was a brutal reminder of his own total powerlessness. The music that brought immense joy to millions of listeners was for him a daily exercise in profound humiliation and suppressed volcanic rage. The history of Teddy Pendergrass and Taaz Lang strips away the magical vacuum of glamour, talent, and inevitable success often sold to the public. It forces a confrontation with the ugly mechanics of systemic exploitation. The issue isn't whether the music they created was beautiful. The music was undeniably brilliant and culturally significant. The issue is the blood price extracted for its creation. The recording industry of that specific era, heavily intertwined with organized crime, did not just steal money from its artists, it systematically stole their human dignity. It required its most valuable assets to surrender their autonomy entirely and exist as highly paid serfs. Taaz Lang's only crime was demanding that the man she loved be treated as a human being with legal rights rather than a commodity to be traded and exploited. She attempted to apply standard legal business practices, independent audits, transparent management, legal separation, to an industry that operated strictly on the violent rules of a street cartel. Her assassination was not a bizarre anomaly. It was the ultimate logical enforcement of the industry's unwritten law. It was a terrifyingly rational business decision made by cold men who viewed a human life as a minor operational expense compared to the tens of millions of dollars at stake. This is the dark truth that the greatest hits compilations and the nostalgic television specials completely omit. They sell the rhythm, but they hide the extortion. They celebrate the magnificent voice, but they deliberately silence the brilliant woman who tried to save it. The integration of organized crime into the Philadelphia music scene was not a well-kept secret. It was simply a truth too dangerous for journalists to print. The Black Mafia, often operating under the guise of various legitimate-sounding community organizations or venue security firms, provided the vital muscle that the record labels needed to enforce predatory contracts and intimidate rivals. When an artist considered leaving a label, or when a radio station hesitated to put a specific record in heavy rotation, the executives did not send lawyers with cease and desist letters. They sent ruthless emissaries from the street. This unholy alliance between corporate music executives in penthouse suites and organized crime syndicates on the pavement created an impenetrable fortress of corruption. Taaz Lang, armed only with financial ledgers, a sharp mind, and a fierce devotion, was essentially trying to breach a concrete fortress guarded by heavily armed men. She understood the massive risks involved, which makes her actions not merely brave, but historically heroic. She was a black woman in the late 1970s, taking on a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise that possessed the tacit cooperation of the local police force and the political establishment. She was fighting a desperate war on multiple fronts, against the predatory label executives, against the violent street enforcers, and against Teddy's own paralyzing fear of the system. Her death was the tragic, perhaps inevitable outcome of an entirely asymmetrical conflict. But her willingness to fight, her absolute refusal to let the man she loved be ground down by the machine, elevates their story from a simple music industry anecdote to a profound human tragedy. For Teddy, the years immediately following 1977 were a masterclass in psychological dissociation. In order to survive the reality of his existence, he had to completely compartmentalize his mind. There was Teddy Pendergrass, the global superstar, the charismatic, invincible entity that existed only under the stage lights and in the isolated vocal booth. And then there was Theodore, the broken, terrified man who locked himself inside his sprawling mansion, surrounded by heavily armed guards, entirely unable to trust a single person in his professional orbit. The massive wealth he accumulated during this period was entirely meaningless to him. He was purchasing expensive vintage cars and vast estates, but he was essentially just buying more comfortable furnishings for his prison cell. The handlers allowed him his extreme luxuries because they understood a fundamental rule of captivity. A comfortable prison is far less likely to riot They strictly managed his investments. They tightly controlled his access to the press, and they ensured that he never spoke of Taaz Lang in a manner that could provoke a new police investigation or threaten their public image. His absolute silence was his only survival strategy, but the silence exacted a terrible corrosive toll on his physical body and his mind. The immense daily stress of maintaining the facade, of looking into the eyes of men he despised and feigning gratitude, began to manifest in highly destructive behaviors. The industry pushed him harder and harder, booking grueling, relentless tour schedules, demanding more platinum albums, squeezing every possible drop of revenue from his vocal cords before his psychological state completely collapsed. He was a machine running entirely on fumes, driven forward by a toxic combination of manufactured public adulation and genuine, unadulterated private terror. He was racing toward a cliff edge, entirely unable to hit the brakes because the men holding the steering wheel refused to let him stop. And this desperate, high-speed flight from his own reality would inevitably lead to a physical crash that would permanently silence the music and seal his fate forever. The subsequent 5 years, spanning roughly from late 1977 to early 1982, represent a historically unprecedented phenomenon in popular music. The absolute peak of an artist's global commercial success occurring simultaneously with the absolute nadir of his personal, psychological, and physical autonomy. The issue we are prosecuting here is not just the exploitation of an artist, but the weaponization of his immense talent against his own humanity by a criminal syndicate. While the general public and music historians frequently categorize this period as the gold years of Teddy Pendergrass, a forensic examination of the structural dynamics of his life reveals a reality that was far closer to highly profitable, indentured servitude under constant armed surveillance. The system that Taaz Lang had attempted to dismantle did not merely survive her assassination, it thrived on it. It had validated its lethal business model. By executing her and burying the investigation, the syndicate had proven to itself, and crucially, to Teddy, that their power was absolute. With Taaz eliminated, there was no longer any intellectual shield filtering access to Teddy, no independent voice questioning the accounting, and no shield against the constant psychological manipulation deployed by his handlers. The syndicate recognized that Teddy was psychologically broken, consumed by grief, and paralyzed by the exact fatal weakness they had identified, a fundamental fear of confrontation and a desperate need to avoid losing the superficial markers of his success. They decided to exploit this vulnerability by accelerating his work schedule to a grueling, almost inhuman pace. The narrative logic of this period is chilling. The more wealth Teddy generated for the machine, the more deeply he was imprisoned within it. In 1978, his album Life is a Song Worth Singing was released, featuring the smash hit Close the Door. It was an overwhelming success, solidifying his status as a global superstar. The syndicate did not offer him time to mourn Taaz. On the contrary, they immediately pushed him into a relentless cycle of production. They recognized that his public image was now inextricably linked to a profound, almost desperate vulnerability that resonated powerfully with his audience, particularly women. They began to market this vulnerability cynically. The public thought they were witnessing raw, authentic soul. In reality, they were witnessing the physical manifestation of chronic trauma. His voice, strained by exhaustion and grief, became his trademark, a commodity to be ruthlessly exploited. This period culminated in one of the most successful marketing campaigns in music history, the for women-only concerts. Engineered by his new manager, Shep Gordon, the strategy was a commercial masterstroke, restricting attendance to create an environment of controlled hysteria and maximizing his appeal as a hyper-masculine sex symbol. Yet, for Teddy, the internal contrast was brutal. Night after night, he assumed the persona of the ultimate powerful lover, performing extreme intimacy for thousands of screaming strangers, while privately carrying the crushing weight of Taaz's unpunished murder. The gap between how the public perceived him, invincible, desirable, dominating, and his inner reality, terrified and profoundly hollowed out, widened to a terrifying chasm. The syndicate understood that explicit physical threats were only one method of control. To ensure his permanent silence regarding Taaz, they constructed a total immersive psychological environment designed to maintain his submission. The handlers surrounding him were not employees in any traditional sense. They were extensions of the criminal organization. Every personal assistant, security guard, and public relations representative on his payroll was selected by the label management and ultimately answered to the syndicate. He was under 24-hour surveillance. Every phone call was monitored. Every conversation was reported back. The system utilized a powerful form of psychological gaslighting to maintain control. They constantly reminded him of how much money they were making for him, contrasting it with his impoverished past. They planted whispers that Taaz's ambition had caused her own death, subtly suggesting that he was partially responsible for getting her involved. They weaponized his own guilt, using his love for Taaz as a leash to keep him compliant, suggesting that any attempt to seek justice or independence would ruin her memory and end his career. This constant, unrelenting pressure had a devastating effect on his psychological and physical well-being. He could not speak about his grief. To mention Taaz was forbidden. He could not fight the system. He had witnessed the cost of rebellion. He could not stop working. The machine required its daily fuel. In any human system, suppressed trauma and unvocalized rage eventually seek an exit. For Teddy, the exit was found in escalating self-destructive behaviors. The general public and the press, operating on superficial observation, interpreted his reckless spending, his increasingly volatile temper, and his growing substance abuse as typical rock star excess. A forensic psychological profile reveals these behaviors not as acts of celebratory excess, but as numbing agents against a terrifying reality. He was attempting to chemically and financially dissociate from his own life. The extensive use of cocaine and alcohol, which became an increasing problem during these peak years, served as his only escape mechanism, a way to survive the cognitive dissonance of performing love songs for the very people who had murdered the woman he loved. The syndicate, far from attempting to curb this dangerous behavior, actually encouraged it, as long as it did not interfere with his performance schedule. They understood that an artist who is chemically dependent is far easier to manage than one who is sober and analytical. A sober Teddy might remember Taaz Lang's blueprint for independence. A numbed Teddy was focused entirely on his immediate survival and his next performance. They provided him with the finest drugs, the most expensive cars, and access to any material luxury he desired, knowing that these items were minor operational expenses compared to the staggering touring and publishing revenue he generated. They essentially transformed him into a wealthy, addicted hostage. His fatal weakness, his aversion to conflict, was locked in place by a system that catered to his addictions while systematically stripping away his humanity. The city of Philadelphia in the late 1970s and early 1980s was experiencing a brutal escalation in Underworld. Power struggles? The JBM, Junior Black Mafia, was beginning to emerge, challenging the established order of the original Black Mafia syndicate that controlled the local music scene. Violence on the streets was commonplace. For Teddy, this ambient violence was a constant reminder of the threat looming just outside the door. He was acutely aware of how close he was to the edge of catastrophe. The handlers used this violence to their advantage, employing increasingly aggressive, heavy-set men as his security detail, positioning themselves not as guards protecting an artist, but as jailers managing an asset. Every performance was a high-stakes environment where a single wrong move, a single defiant word, could lead to a sudden and violent termination. Every performance became a high-wire act of survival, forcing him to project unbridled joy while consumed by absolute terror. By late 1981, the physical and psychological cost of this existence was becoming impossible to hide. The erosion of his humanity was evident to those who looked past the stage lighting. His live performances, while still powerful, showed subtle signs of strain. His voice, once invincible, was occasionally frayed. He became increasingly erratic, showing flashes of volatile temper backstage that terrified his musicians and promoters. He was a human machine running at maximum capacity without maintenance, driven forward by a toxic mixture of manufactured public adulation and genuine private terror. The system, sensing that their most valuable commodity was beginning to crack, did not slow down. Instead, they pushed harder. They demanded another massive tour, another platinum album, squeezing every remaining ounce of revenue from his body and soul before the inevitable collapse occurred. The narrative of these 5 years is not a success story. It is a tragedy of catastrophic proportion. It is the story of how an entire society became complicit in consuming the art of a captive man. The general public, the media, and the fans who adored him were unknowingly supporting and funding the very criminal organization that had executed Taaz Lang. The music, in all its lush, romantic perfection, was essentially a product of industrial-scale extortion. The system had won. They had successfully demonstrated that they could market a trauma victim as a global sex symbol, and that an entire industry would look the other way as long as the cash continued to flow. We must sit with this uncomfortable truth. Every time a Pendergrass record was played during this era, it was a sound that had been secured by the blood of Taaz Lang and the permanent silence of Teddy Pendergrass. The trajectory was now locked on a fatal collision course, driven forward by a desperate, high-speed flight from a reality he could no longer bear to inhabit. The trajectory of Teddy Pendergrass by the early spring of 1982 was no longer a functioning musical career. It was a psychological freefall waiting for a physical impact. Many historians who examine the timeline of the Philadelphia soul era point to this specific window as the moment the system finally pushed its most valuable asset past the point of human endurance. The grueling tour schedules, the chronic insomnia, the heavy substance reliance, and the constant suffocating surveillance by industry handlers had systematically dismantled his nervous system. He was a man operating in a state of permanent, suppressed panic. He possessed millions of dollars in his bank accounts, yet he could not purchase the one thing Taaz Lang had died trying to secure for him: autonomy. The paranoia that had defined his existence since her assassination in 1977 was now his baseline reality. Every time he entered a recording studio or stepped onto a stage, he was acutely aware that he was generating capital for a machine that operated entirely on extortion and violence. On the night of March 18th, 1982, this internal psychological collapse violently manifested in the physical world. Teddy Pendergrass was driving his 1981 Rolls-Royce Silver Spirit through the East Falls section of Philadelphia. The vehicle itself was a symbol of his gilded captivity, the type of extravagant purchase actively encouraged by a management structure designed to keep artists perpetually indebted and visually compliant. He was navigating Lincoln Drive, a winding, notoriously treacherous stretch of road. Some investigative reports and subsequent accident reconstruction suggest that the brakes on the heavy luxury vehicle failed, while other accounts point to sheer physical exhaustion and severely compromised reflexes. What is not disputed is the catastrophic violence of the next few seconds. The Rolls-Royce veered sharply across the center divider, violently crossed into the oncoming lanes, and smashed head-on into a guardrail before striking two large trees. The impact was absolute. The metal frame of the car was crushed, trapping the singer inside the wreckage for nearly an hour before emergency personnel could extricate him using heavy hydraulic equipment. The physical damage was devastating and permanent. The impact shattered his neck, specifically the 5th and 6th cervical vertebrae, completely severing his spinal cord. At 31 years old, at the absolute zenith of his commercial earning power and global fame, Teddy Pendergrass was instantly rendered a quadriplegic. He was paralyzed from the chest down, losing all function in his legs, and severe impairment in his arms and hands. The news sent shockwaves through the global music industry and triggered massive public outpourings of grief from millions of fans. However, to truly understand the historical weight of this moment, we must analyze the reaction of the system that controlled him. Looking past the public statements of sorrow issued by record label executives, for the syndicate, the men who operated the Philadelphia music scene and monitored his every move, the tragedy was not the loss of a human being's mobility. It was the sudden, catastrophic breakdown of their primary revenue engine. The recording industry of that era did not possess a social safety net for artists who could no longer generate immediate cash flow. The moment the doctors confirmed the permanent nature of his paralysis, the suffocating grip of his handlers began to loosen, not out of compassion, but out of cold economic utility. He could no longer command sold-out arenas for the highly lucrative, for women-only tours. He could no longer be physically manipulated on stage to sell a manufactured image of dominant sexuality. The machine recognized that the product was broken, and the syndicate immediately began to divert its resources, its aggressive management tactics, and its street-level enforcers toward newer, younger, and fully mobile artists within the city. This sudden abandonment reveals the stark, terrifying truth of his existence. The moment he ceased to be a compliant, highly profitable asset, the constant surveillance vanished. He was left entirely alone in his sprawling mansion, confined to a motorized wheelchair, forced to confront the wreckage of his own life in total silence. The irony is deeply cruel. The catastrophic destruction of his physical body was the only event capable of breaking the syndicate's psychological hold over his daily schedule. He was finally free from the grueling demands of the handlers, but the price of that freedom was permanent immobility. The golden prison that Taaz Lang had identified and tried to destroy had simply been replaced by a prison of titanium and medical equipment. During the subsequent 28 years of his life, the trauma of 1977 remained an unhealed, festering wound. The public narrative focused entirely on his physical rehabilitation. The media celebrated his courage when he managed to return to the stage at the Live Aid concert in 1985, singing from his wheelchair in a powerful, emotionally charged performance. They documented his efforts to establish a foundation for individuals with spinal cord injuries. He was framed as a triumphant survivor of a terrible accident, but the media actively ignored the deeper, darker survival story. They never asked him about the cold case sitting in the filing cabinets of the Philadelphia Police Department. They never questioned why a man with his resources never publicly launched a private investigation into the assassination of the woman who had been the love of his life. The answer to that silence lies in the deeply ingrained institutionalized fear that had dictated his entire adult life. Even though his active earning power had diminished, the men who controlled the underworld structure of Philadelphia in the 1970s and 1980s were still present, still powerful, and still deeply embedded in the local economy. The unwritten laws of the Black Mafia and the corrupt elements of the city's power structure did not disappear simply because Teddy Pendergrass could no longer walk. To speak publicly about Taaz Lang, to point fingers at the executives and the silent partners who had profited from his career, would have been an act of suicidal defiance. He knew that the system was perfectly capable of eliminating threats, and he knew that his physical vulnerability now made him an even easier target. He was a man trapped in a terrible paradox. He had survived the machine, but he could never truly escape its shadow. He had to live every single day with the agonizing knowledge that the brilliant, courageous woman who tried to save him was forgotten by the justice system, while the men who likely ordered her death continued to live in luxury, funded by the royalties of the songs he had sung. Teddy Pendergrass passed away in January 2010 at the age of 59, following complications from colon cancer. When he died, the obituaries across the globe universally highlighted his massive chart success, his revolutionary impact on R&B, and the tragic nature of his car accident, but they completely omitted the political and economic reality of his life. He took the names of Taaz Lang's killers to his grave. The silence he maintained for over 3 decades was final. The authorities in Philadelphia never reopened the 1977 murder file. No executive was ever indicted. No hitman was ever identified. The system protected itself perfectly, leaving behind only the music as a sanitized record of a deeply corrupted era. The story of Teddy Pendergrass and Taaz Lang is not a romantic tragedy. It is a brutally objective case study in the intersection of systemic racism, predatory capitalism, and organized crime. The Philadelphia soul sound was marketed to the world as the ultimate expression of love, harmony, and emotional depth. It was sold as a black cultural triumph. But beneath the lush string sections and the flawless vocal harmonies was an industrial-scale operation designed to strip black artists of their wealth, their autonomy, and, when deemed necessary, their lives. The artists were treated as entirely expendable raw materials. They were handed microphones and told to sing, while the ledgers were controlled by men who operated in the shadows, enforcing their contracts with intimidation and gunfire. Taaz Lang's profound significance lies in her absolute refusal to accept this reality. Many historians who look past the surface of the music industry recognize her not merely as a manager, but as a direct threat to a highly organized criminal monopoly. She saw the fundamental injustice of the system and chose to attack it head on. She did not seek a slightly better percentage. She sought total liberation for the man she loved. Her intelligence, her strategic auditing of the hidden financial records, and her daring plan to establish an independent production company represent one of the most courageous acts of defiance in the history of American entertainment. She was a black woman operating in a viciously male-dominated criminal, high-influenced industry, and she managed to outsmart them on paper. The only way the system could stop her was through blunt, lethal force. For the men operating in the shadows, her death functioned as a brutal but effective enforcement of their business model. It worked. It kept Teddy Pendergrass in the vocal booth, it kept the records selling, and it kept the illicit revenue flowing into the pockets of the syndicate. But while the system succeeded economically, it failed to entirely erase the truth. The objective facts of the crime scene, the untouched money, the unbothered jewelry, remain as permanent, undeniable evidence of a targeted execution, completely contradicting the police narrative of a random robbery. These facts stand as a silent witness to her bravery. The legacy of Teddy Pendergrass extends far beyond platinum records and concert footage. Behind the global superstar was a man held hostage by his own success, terrified into silence and forced to sing love songs while carrying the psychological weight of an unpunished murder. His phenomenal voice was real, but the freedom it implied was a carefully constructed lie. The classic tracks of the Philadelphia era carry a hidden blood price. The smooth romantic sounds of the 1970s were subsidized by extortion and physical violence. The true legacy of this story is not found in the music charts. It is found in the courage of Taaz Lang. She was the actual heart of the operation, the brilliant strategist who died because she believed that a legendary artist deserved to be a free man. History has a profound obligation to strip away the glamorous mythology of the music business, to look directly at the violence it utilized to build its empires, and to finally speak the name of the woman the system tried so desperately to bury.